Hello everyone, and welcome to the Vietnam War program. This is a show dedicated to discussing the Vietnam War. If you have ever visited the Cu Chi tunnels, you may understand the following comment from an American tourist. The Cu Chi tunnels are not for the faint of heart. Inside, it is very hot, dark, and cramped, only about 1 meter high and 60 centimeters wide. With a camera in hand, I could only crawl on my hands and knees. As you move through the tunnel, it feels like you are walking in complete darkness. The closer you get to the exit, the more sweat soaks through your body. I wonder how people could live for months in these tunnels when just a few minutes in there felt like a difficult challenge to me. Additionally, a U.S. soldier who returned to visit the Cu Chi tunnels after the war exclaimed, "The tunnels here are like the subway tunnels in New York." These comments highlight just how extraordinary it was to build, live, and work in the Cu Chi tunnels. Back in the day, the Cu Chi tunnels were the site of a great battle of wits between our forces and the mighty American military. Both sides had to constantly come up with ways to counter each other's tactics. In 1966, the U.S. organized Operation the Trap, mobilizing 12,000 troops, a combined force of air power, tanks, and artillery to attack the Cu Chi tunnels. It was an operation they were very proud of, expecting a victory. However, Vietnam had predicted this a year in advance, and had prepared everything meticulously. The tunnel system was expanded and designed on a grander scale. In the past, each household dug tunnels individually, but now the houses were connected. The areas for eating, sleeping, storing goods, and manufacturing weapons were all meticulously planned. When the U.S. launched Operation the Trap, their goal was to surround the guerrillas beneath Cu Chi. They thought it was simple: just send troops into the tunnels, and they would easily catch the guerrillas, like trapping rats. However, as soon as they stepped into Cu Chi, they were met with fierce resistance from our forces. Confident in their advanced weaponry, American soldiers chased our troops like in an action movie. But unfortunately, every time they caught up a little, they lost track of their targets, leaving them scared and confused. Eventually, the Americans discovered the entrances to our tunnels. They immediately began pumping smoke into the tunnel entrances with the sole purpose of locating the remaining exits. They thought that pumping smoke would force those inside the tunnels to suffocate and eventually crawl out through another exit. However, in reality, the U.S. soon realized that the Vietnamese tunnel system was so extensive that when they pumped smoke into one entrance, they waited a long time without seeing smoke coming out anywhere else. Everything surpassed the Americans' expectations. The Americans had to find ways to identify the entrances and air holes for oxygen. They figured that once they found these points, they could pour water or pump gas into the tunnels, and our troops would be forced to die. To locate the tunnel entrances, the Americans had their soldiers use stethoscopes to listen to the ground as if they were taking blood pressure for the earth itself. The goal was to identify where any sounds were coming from below, then mark those spots as potential tunnel entrances. Theoretically, this method seemed feasible, but in practice, it was time-consuming and ineffective because the Cu Chi tunnels were so vast. So the Americans used their Beck Day dogs, trained German shepherds that cost tens of thousands of dollars each. These dogs were trained to sniff out human scents and help the Americans detect the tunnel entrances. However, our troops weren't about to give up easily. Initially, we came up with the idea of mixing dried chili powder and black pepper, then sprinkling it into the ventilation holes. This method was effective at first, but eventually the Beck Day dogs began coughing, making the Americans realize our location again. Fortunately, the Vietnamese troops thought of using soap, clothing, and perfumes from the American soldiers to mask the scent for the dogs. The Beck Day dogs were so accustomed to the scent of their handlers that when they smelled it, they would simply pass by without alerting their commanders. However, in those days, there wasn't an abundance of soap, clothing, or perfume to use for all the ventilation holes. Therefore, we launched a campaign to use whatever we had to trick the dogs, setting traps that not only caught people, but also trapped the dogs. Every time the Americans used their dogs to detect our positions, a total of 300 Beck Day dogs died or were shot by our troops. People jokingly said that wherever the dogs went, the leaves would grow back there. This is why some culinary experts believe that Cu Chi may have been the birthplace of the 7-course fake tree dish, to avoid eating bland, steamed food. Additionally, they speculate that the reason the American four-legged officers escaped from Vietnam was that it happened to be the first of the month. Before the 15th, surely no one would have escaped. Of course, this is just the experts' speculation after finishing their meals on the table. As for the truth of the matter, no official documents have recorded it yet. Some might ask, what happened to the dogs that escaped from Vietnam? According to some records, after the Paris Peace Agreement was signed, only 204 out of thousands of dogs were kept to serve in other tasks. The rest were discarded because they were no longer useful. Some of the dogs were traumatized due to long-term missions, while others became stars on YouTube, sharing knowledge and cooking spiritual dishes. Regarding the use of working dogs, the US came up with the idea of pumping pepper spray into the tunnels through the holes they had detected. Pepper spray is a non-lethal substance, but it's often used for riot control because it causes a burning sensation in the eyes, nose, and mouth when it makes contact. This made it very uncomfortable for our guerrillas. While dealing with pepper spray on the ground was easy, living in tunnels without gas masks meant there was nothing that could resist it. After a few days, we also thought of a way to counter it. Since the tunnel system was designed with multiple layers, we created trapdoors to separate the layers. If the lower layer heard screaming from the upper layer, they would immediately shut the door to block the gas from spreading. Along with this, with our knowledge of traditional medicine, our soldiers figured out a way to use urine to counteract the effects of pepper spray. If they were exposed to it and couldn't escape, they would urinate on a cloth and cover their mouth, eyes, and nose. The ammonia in the urine would reduce the pain caused by the pepper spray. But in reality, it was simple for our troops and the people of Cu Chi. When the Americans switched to flooding the tunnels with water, they felt this method was more feasible. Since the Cu Chi tunnels were located near the Saigon River, they thought that pumping water from the river into the tunnels would overwhelm our forces. They believed that no matter how wide the tunnels were, if they drained all the water from the Saigon River into the tunnels, they would certainly flood them. The plan seemed solid, but when it came to practical implementation, everything turned out to be completely different. The tunnel system was over 100 kilometers long, so the water seeped into the ground, and even if there was flooding, it would only flood a section. If not, the water would flow through the tunnels and out into the Saigon River. To the Americans, the idea of pumping water seemed as groundbreaking as the invention of fire. However, for the people and soldiers of Cu Chi, it was like a child's game, because we had already accounted for this when building the tunnels. So even though the Americans pumped water from the Saigon River, it eventually flowed out into the river, with nothing changing. The tunnels were separated by water-resistant doors, ensuring that places storing weapons and ammunition remained secure and unaffected. Each time the Americans pumped water, our soldiers inside would joke, "Lift your feet so the servant can pour water in the middle of the tunnel." Water didn't work, pepper spray didn't work, so why didn't the Americans use bombs to flood the tunnels? At that point, how would we defend ourselves? Of course, the American soldiers had been supplemented with DHA milk from a young age, so there was no reason why they wouldn't have considered using even more advanced bombs. But the story doesn't end here. There's still much more to tell, and I'll leave that for another time. In the meantime, if any of you watching happen to sell Tet fruits or dishes, please send me an email to discuss. If possible, we can even collaborate on selling Tet items. Otherwise, I just need something to buy as gifts for everyone. So that's it for today's episode of Vietnam War. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel Vietnam War to help me reach 1 million subscribers.